organized by the Islamic Renaissance Front, Malaysia. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I'm Nageeb Gounjaria, Senior Research Fellow at the Islamic Renaissance Front, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. We have two panelists today, Dr. Olsi Jazexhi and Dr. Emir Hadzikadunic. And our topic today is, was Russia's intervention in Ukraine the result of Western aggression, impact on the Muslim world from the Balkans to the Nusantara? Some background information about this topic. Ukraine was a cornerstone of the Soviet Union, the arch rival of the United States during the Cold War. They share strong familial bonds that go back centuries. Kyiv, Ukraine's capital, is sometimes referred to as the mother of Russian cities. It was in Kyiv in the 8th and 9th centuries that Christianity was brought from Byzantium to the Slavic peoples. And it was Christianity that served as an anchor for Kievan Rus, the early Slavic state from which modern Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians draw their lineage. But Western scholars disagree somewhat on the motivations behind Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Some emphasize NATO's post-Cold War expansion, which Russia has viewed with increasing alarm. In 2004, NATO added 7 members, its 5th expansion and largest one to date, including the former Soviet Baltic republics Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. 4 years later, when NATO declared its intent to bring Ukraine and Georgia into the fold at some point in the future, Russia made clear a red line had been crossed. Other experts dispute that Russia's fear of NATO was its primary motive, countering that the NATO expansion question had largely dissolved after 2008 as Western governments lost interest and Russia increased its influence in Ukraine. Rather, they say, the biggest factor behind Russia's intervention was Putin's fear of losing power at home, particularly after historic anti-government protests erupted in Russia in late 2011. Putin claimed US actors were sowing this unrest and thereafter began casting the United States as an arch enemy to rally his political base. It was by looking through this Cold War redux lens that he chose to intervene in Ukraine, they say. But we should not forget that the former US National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in early 1994, described a healthy and stable Ukraine as a critical counterweight to Russia and the linchpin of what he advocated should be the new US grand strategy after the Cold War. It cannot be stressed strongly enough that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. But with Ukraine suborned and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire, he wrote. With this background, this webinar that features experts in history and international relations will debate and discuss about this geopolitical issue and whether it would have any social or political ramifications to this side of the world in general and to the Muslim Ummah in particular. So this is how the program will run today. We are going to have as our first speaker, Dr. Olsi Jazexhi, and then we'll have the second speaker, Dr. Emir Hadzikadunic, and this will be followed by a question and answer session from the audience, and after that we are going to conclude. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please type your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, Zoom screen. And with this, I'm going to give an introduction about our first speaker, Dr. Olsi Jazexhi. Dr. Olsi Jazexhi is an Albanian-Canadian historian who teaches Russian history at the International Islamic University, Malaysia. He has previously taught history at University of Durres and University of Elbasan in Albania. He's a social activist and an independent media critic who consistently challenges the mainstream media narratives in Albania and Kosovo. Dr. Jazexhi is a regular guest commentator for Top Channel, Clan, News 24, MCN News, and other major TV stations in Albania. He has been interviewed by Press TV in Iran, TRT World in Turkey, CBC News in Canada about issues that are related to China and the Middle East. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Olsi Jazexhi, our first speaker for today.
Assalamu alaikum to everyone, and thank you for hosting and inviting me to this interesting discussion. Today, of course, we're going to talk about the present conflict in Ukraine and Russian intervention. Now, before doing that, I'd like to share a presentation, but okay, here it is. So before I share my presentation, I'd like to share a map of Russia with all our viewers so that we can have an idea about what we are talking. So as you can see, Russia is the largest country of our planet. It is 1/5 of the Earth, and is a country that describes itself as Evrazia, Eurasian country. A country that only a small part of it. Can you see the mouse when I move it over the screen here? Yeah. So which only a part of it lies in Europe and the rest of it lies in Asia. And it is geography which determines the behavior of Russia, a country which is a superpower, a military superpower. And this map in a way will show to us the importance of Ukraine for Russia. For people who know the history of Russia, they know how this country evolved into becoming a major world superpower, and is one of the countries that has colonized more Muslim lands than probably any other country in history. And at the same time, has been the major country which has defended Christian Orthodoxy since the evangelization of the Rus into the Byzantine Christianity. And Ukraine, which you can see where my mouse is here, which after the fall of the Soviet Union became an independent country, has been a piece of land for which Russians fought since I would say since the 16th century, 17th, and finally in the 18th century, they managed to conquer it, to remove the Ottomans from the coastal areas of Ukraine, where we have nowadays the war in cities like Mariupol and others. And the Russians managed through their massive colonization of these areas with Slavic Christians that they brought from Europe and from central areas of Russia to turn the demography of this part of the world and to turn it into a Russian reality. But now let me go back to my PowerPoint presentation for which I was working until now. So I'll stop this one and I'm going to share my PowerPoint in order to give to our viewers a better look of what is really going on. So you can see the presentation, I hope. Nageeb, can you see it?
Yes, we can see, Dr. Olsi. Please go ahead.
All right. So when we talk about the Russian intervention in Ukraine, and as the title says, was it a result of the Western aggression? My simple answer is yes. And for people who study history of the Soviet Union and of Russia after the fall of Soviet Union, this has been a history of conflict between the Anglo-American Empire, which is, I can put it an oceanic empire, the empire which rules the seas, and the Russian Empire, which historically have been the continental empire of Europe. The fight that we have today in Ukraine is not new. It is many centuries old. For people who study Russian and Ottoman history, we know that since the 18th century, when finally Catherine the Great managed to defeat the Ottomans and take from them the Khanate of Crimea, always will have the British and the French who will support the Turkish Muslims in order to keep Russians far from the sea. Historically, the war of the Russians in order to become a dominant power in Europe has been to come to the seas, because Russia is a continental power. It has the Arctic Ocean in the north, but this ocean is not easy to navigate. You cannot navigate during the winter. So the war of Russia has been to expand itself into Pacific by taking from China the port of Vladivostok, and from Japan to take the Kuril Islands and others. And on the other hand, the other war of Russia was against the Ottomans and Poland in order to obtain and to create what we know nowadays as Ukraine. Now, the thing is that with the fall of the Soviet Union and the chaos that happened when the Soviet Union fell, we had the total chaos throughout Eastern Europe, mass destruction. We had civil wars and hot wars from the conflict in ex-Yugoslavia, with the conflict between Serbia and Croatia and Slovenia and Bosnia and Kosovo. And of course, we had even conflicts in Caucasus and in Russia itself. In these conflicts, we always had the Anglo-Americans playing the game of divide and rule. And we know about the Chechen conflict, how CIA sponsored Muslim separatism within Russia, and we know how the Russians managed to have a bloody comeback and to defeat the Chechens, and as we can see now, what is happening to pacify them and to turn them into loyal Muslims. Yes?
Dr. Olsi, sorry. Yeah, the slides are not moving.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to move it
okay.
now. I'm going to move it.
Okay.
All right. So let's come to the 2022 Russian intervention in Ukraine. So for our viewers, this intervention started on I think 24th of February. The date should be wrong here, but it started since 22. After the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, they declared their independence from Ukraine. I'm sorry, I just wrote the presentation, so you can see some mistakes in here. And these two republics, which have been fighting with the government of Kiev since 2014, they asked from Russia for help. Now, as I'm going to explain later on, we had two separatist republics, the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, which they simply wanted to be not part of Ukraine, especially since 2014, as a result of the attacks against Russians and Orthodox Christians within the Ukraine. And these Russophone people of Ukraine, they had enough. And in a way, Ukraine is a kind of Soviet Yugoslavia. Like in Yugoslavia, you had Slovens and Croats and Serbs and Albanians and Bosnians and Macedonians who, after the collapse of communism, everyone wanted to go his own way. Ukraine is almost the same kind of story. Now, before doing this, we have the Russian government since 2014 and 15 with the so-called Minsk agreements, where the Russian government demanded from Ukraine to implement a ceasefire with these two separatist republics, to withdraw the heavy weapons from the front line, to release prisoners of war, to do constitutional reform, whereby what the Russians were demanding from Ukraine is that Ukraine to become a kind of Canada, where you have Anglophone Canada, but you have a Francophone Quebec as well. So the Russians asked Ukraine to become a kind of Canada, and also to grant self-government to certain areas of Donbass and Luhansk. But what happened is that since 2014, the government of Kiev did not respond to the concerns of Russia, But on the other hand, we had what the Russians call a genocide against the Orthodox Christians, and in particular against the Russophones of Ukraine. They were prohibited from using their language. We had mass killings of Russians in Ukraine, like we had the massacre of Odessa, and moreover, Donetsk and Luhansk were under constant bombardment. So the situation was somehow similar with what we had in Kosovo or in Yugoslavia when Serbia was bombing its neighbors. On the other hand, Ukraine kept on provoking Russia. It demanded openly and changed the constitution, demanded to join NATO. And before the Russian intervention, a few days before, the Jewish Zionist president of Ukraine, for whom I'm going to speak a bit later on, he even declared that Ukraine was going to develop nuclear weapons. So this was beyond any red line for Russia, because Ukraine has already the capabilities. It is way more developed than Turkey or Iran to develop nuclear weapons. It has the know-how, the technology, and the Russians went into a panic mode. And moreover, we had the Ukrainian army, which had amassed in the border of Donetsk and Luhansk, and they were shelling civilians. But now, for our viewers, we have to explain something, that the conflict in Ukraine, this hot conflict, didn't start today, but the breaking point was in 2014, when we had the so-called the Maidan Revolution, which was in a way a civil war between the Catholic and Uniat groups of Ukraine, led by the Jewish Zionist lobby, against the Orthodox Russophone people of Ukraine. So if I can go to this map, this shows about the first coup which occurred in 2004. But I just want to show this map for our viewers. And as you can see in the first one, the blue areas are the areas where the Russophones of Ukraine live. And in time of the Ottomans and Catherine the Great, this area where my mouse is moving was known as Novorussia. And the area where my mouse is moving now, where is Kiev, was known as Malorussia. The real or historical Ukraine for Russians has been this area here on my left, where we have the Poles, the Catholics, the Ruthenians, the Galicians, the Rusianin, different ethnic groups which were added later on to Ukraine. So if you can see the other map, which is down, the areas with rows, it shows where we have this other group of people. Now, to make it much simpler for our viewers, the conflict in Ukraine is like somehow like in Yugoslavia, where you had the Catholic Croats who were fighting against the Orthodox Serbs, and you had the Muslim Bosnians in between. So if I can go back to this other slide, here is the infamous US Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, who is also a government minister for the Biden administration, who together with Ambassador Geoffrey Piat, they orchestrated and openly supported a coup d'etat in Ukraine in December 2013 until February 2014, when they amassed a group of rebels, and they attacked the government of President Yanukovych, who was the democratically elected president of Ukraine, but they forced him to flee. The reason for the rebellion that the Americans caused in this time was because Yanukovych did not want to sign a political association and free trade agreement with the European Union. Instead, by, of course, representing the Russophones of Ukraine, he wanted to have closer relations with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. And in the time, as we have the videos at internet, but for our Islamic viewers, I cannot show them, it was the Americans with Victoria Nuland who went to Kiev, and they spent millions of dollars to incite a rebellion against the democratically government of Yanukovych. And it was the Americans who in a way destroyed all peaceful European attempts to, in a way, westernize Ukraine. And she even said a very nasty term that I cannot even mention here, but where she in a way was insulting Europe. And she said, we have to do a coup and to remove forcefully Yanukovych from power. Victoria and Jeffrey Pat, they installed in power these people that you can see here, Klitschko and other neo-Nazis, which you can go into detail if you see the videos. Now, what happened in 2014 was not the coup, first coup that happened in Ukraine. We had another coup which happened in 2004, when in the time, in November 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, who won the presidential elections as the representative of the Party of Regions candidate, he upset the Americans, who in return, they made a coup. It was the Americans, the Soros Foundation, who made the so-called Orange Revolution, and they forced Yanukovych to accept a rerun for the elections in December 2004, and when they brought to power Yanukovych as the new president of Ukraine. As many Western medias and even Soros Foundation has admitted, it was the Democratic, the National Democratic Institute, the Republican Institute, the United States Department of State, USAID, and Soros, who spent at least $14 million to create troubles and a coup in 2004 against the pro-Russian government of Yanukovych, and to bring in power Yushchenko and other extremist groups. The coup of 2014, as it was even depicted in many Western medias, was blessed by many extremist American politicians, like you have John McCain, who went to Ukraine and supported anti-Semitic and neo-Nazi politicians who were openly propagating for the defense of role of Ukraine during the Second World War, the internal conflict that many fascist groups had with the Jews, and they were openly supporting them only to get rid of the Russians. And here you have the picture of John McCain with Arseny Yatsenuk. Now, the recent military intervention of Russia in Ukraine has in a way, upset the West in a way unimaginable, because as it was mentioned by Nageeb during the presentation, the geostrategical aim of the Americans since the time of the Soviet Union, but even after fall of it, has been to follow Lord Smyth's dictum, the first Secretary General of NATO, who used to say when NATO was created in 1940s, that the aim of NATO is to keep the Americans in Europe, Germany down, and the Russians out. Actually, what did the government of Vladimir Putin do with the Europeans for the last 2 decades was that Russia tried very much to integrate itself into the European Union. There were moments when Russia even offered to NATO to join NATO and to become part of the European security bloc, but they were always rejected. And on the other hand, by following the schemes of Brzezinski that you mentioned, the main aim of the Americans has been to, like Brzezinski said, to burn the borders of Russia, and in particular to take Ukraine from Russia, because Ukraine has historically been a contested land between what Huntington calls the dividing line of clash of civilization. I mean, Ukraine is a country like Yugoslavia, where you have the Catholics, you have the Orthodox, and you have the Muslims who belong to different civilizations. I mean, Russians have historically fought with the Poles and the Lithuanians. They have defeated them historically, and especially after the Second World War, they prevailed. And this is how Ukraine was created. But the Americans were very smart to incite these internal conflicts, and in a way to take away Ukraine from the Russians. So the intervention of 2022 by Putin in Ukraine was in a way a response to what happened to Ukraine in 2004 and 2014. Russians, they got tired of American coups against and discrimination against the Russophones, and Putin went for the final solution, which is number one, to annex the Russophone parts of Ukraine, or if not, to probably even divide Ukraine. Now, this slide that I'm showing here, it shows what was really happening in Ukraine, something that forced the Russians to intervene. Apart from the threat by Ukrainians to join NATO and to develop the nuclear bomb, what Russians discovered, and there was a big fight at the United Nations Security Council last week, but we know what is happening now with Russia, total censorship, and nobody cared about it. But the Russian military, they discovered that in Ukraine, the US Army had more than 8 military biological labs where they were experimenting from COVID-19 to anthrax, and these viruses were, according to the Russians, were put into birds in order to spread it in the Russian areas. Now, because we have to talk even about the impact of this conflict in the Balkans, in Europe, and even here in Southeast Asia. As we all know, the conflict in Ukraine is causing major disruptions of oil supplies and energy supplies to Europe. We're having protests. This protest is in Albania. We have mass protests in Italy, in Germany, in Greece, in Bulgaria, but much of it is not being shown in the press because we have a total censorship. But because of the total embargo that the West has put to the Russians, because NATO doesn't dare, and America, they don't dare to go to a nuclear war with Russia over Ukraine, we're having poverty developing very, very fast throughout the Western Europe. Here we have Albanians who are protesting. We have people who are protesting in Italy, in France. We are having riots in Corsica because what happened overnight is that the price of gas has gone up, the price of wheat is growing up because after all, Russia is a major energy resource for and food resource for us, the Europeans. Now, this map in a way is to show to our viewers the areas which are dominated by the Russophones, more or less, and the Uniats and Catholics in Ukraine. So this area that you see here in red, this was part of the Islamic Khanate of the Tatars of Crimea until the 18th century, which was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, which Catherine the Great and Russians, they managed to invade and defeat. And with the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainarju, they took this southern part of Ukraine, and they made it what I explained before as Novorussia. Now, when we have elections in Ukraine, the Party of Regions, which was the party of Yanukovych, gets most of the votes from this area. And in this very moment that we're speaking, the Russian army has almost occupied all this area, with the exception of Odessa. What is the aim of the Russians? As I explained before, as you can see down here, we have the Black Sea. So the strategy of Russians is always to have a foot in a warm seas. And in 2014, they achieved one of their greatest successes in their history by getting bases in Syria. Now they are a Mediterranean power, but they do not want to lose their foot in the Black Sea. So as I see the situation standing right now is that Russians, their military intervention in what we might call Novorussia, they are probably thinking to separate this part in red from Ukraine to create independent republics like the example of Crimea or Abkhazia and Ossetia, and later on to unite them with Mother Russia. Now, something that is very interesting, I think, for our Islamic viewers is to explain the religious aspect of this conflict. As Patrick Kirill, who is the chief patriarch of the Russian Orthodoxy, and for people who know Christian Orthodoxy, the Russians claim that Moscow is the third Rome after Islam invaded Constantinople or Istanbul, and the Orthodox Christians were left without an empire and a state to defend Christianity. So according to Kirill, the view of the Orthodox Church is that Kiev is the Jerusalem of Russians. As it was mentioned in the presentation here, and for students who follow my Russian history courses, the Russian identity and their Christianization is related to the city of Kiev. And in a khutbah, or in a sermon that Patrick Kirill held on March the 6th, there is in Christian LGBT vice. Can you hear me? Nageeb? Hello?
Yeah, it was breaking up a bit, but it's okay now.
Yeah, so in a way, the war in Ukraine, apart from saving the Russophones and from stopping the NATO expansion towards the borders of Russia, is seen even as a war for fighting, for defending the Christian nature of Kiev and the Russophone areas of Ukraine against LGBT vice. So what is this LGBT vice has to do with it? Then it comes to the Zionist control over Ukraine. For people who read the Jewish medias, they are attacking Putin as an anti-Semite, and they are defending the Jewish president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. Why is that so? It is very complicated. Number one is because most of the Jews that we have nowadays in Israel, the so-called Israelis, they are not Yahudi, they are not Beni Israel of the Quran, they are not descendants of Hazreti Musa, but they are the Khazars. They were Turkic Slavic people who lived in the areas of Russia and Ukraine, who in the 8th century, they accepted Judaism as their religion. According to Ibn Fadlan, for people who have read the Rihla of Ibn Fadlan, who was the religious scholar that the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad sent to Turkic Bulgars, for medieval Muslim historians, the Khazars, they were the Yajuj wa Majuj. It is this group of people who make 80% of what we know nowadays as Israelis, and these are the white Jews of Europe, who they are not Beni Israel, but they are converts into Judaism. Now, historically, Russia and Central Europe has been a place of clash between Christianity and the surviving Jews of Khazaria. So we had many pogroms, and then we will culminate with the Holocaust by Hitler, who will always target this group of people who will be attacked for so many kinds of reasons. Now, after the creation of the State of Israel, we had people who rule today Israel. There are people who come from Ukraine, Poland, and Russia. People like Ariel Sharon, who is a Belarusian, Benjamin Netanyahu, or Shimon Peres, who are Poles, Zelensky or Golda Meir, who are Ukrainians, and even Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States, is an Ashkenazi Jew from Ukraine. And now, when Zelensky was elected as a president of Ukraine, and his prime minister was also Jew, if you could see, the Jewish press was full with articles saying Ukraine, the first country outside Israel with Jewish president and prime minister. So in many Jewish circles, the idea was that Ukraine is going to become a second Israel. Last May, when Israel was bombing Gaza, Zelensky was praying for the criminal IDF, which was massacring Muslims. And if you see, okay, I didn't include that. No, it is here, but yeah, the second picture, we have Jewish rabbis who pray for Zelensky, and they explain to their Jews that we came from Ukraine. So, you know, in a way, the conflict in Ukraine, we can describe it as a conflict between Christianity and Zionism. And people like Soros, who have organized a coup d'etat, since taking power in Ukraine with their puppets, they have pushed the LGBT and anti-Christian agenda. Christianity is not something that you have to appreciate. And moreover, we had open attacks against Russian Orthodox churches. So in a way, and then when we see the declarations from the Russian Orthodox Church, and if we see even the Serbian Orthodox priests in Balkans, they see this as a kind of a comeback of Christianity and revenge against the Ashkenazi Zionists who have taken over their country. So this is a map of where the Russian army located at the present. And this area here in red is what I was describing as the Novorussia. And I think today Mariupol, which was a major city in the Azov Sea, has already fallen. And for people who see videos from Ukraine, we have even many Islamic fighters from Chechnya who are fighting for Mother Russia, their home country now. And they are liberating Novorussia because it seems that in a way Putin was smart enough to co-opt the Chechen Muslims and to convince them that we're fighting a war against the degeneracy that people like Soros and others brought. So the conflict is very interesting. We have a geopolitical interest of two great empires. One is Anglo-American empire, and on the other is the Russian Empire. We have a religious conflict between the control of the Zionists like Soros, Antony Blinken, Zelensky of Ukraine, a country where 70% of the population is Orthodox Christians. And on the other hand, we have the Orthodox Russians who say, this is our Jerusalem and we have to liberate it. So the conflict is very interesting, but in a conclusion for our Muslim viewers, I would say that we Muslims shouldn't be very much worried about what is happening in Ukraine, because my fear as historian was that after coming of Biden to power, the Americans could have been pushed by Israel to bomb Ankara or Tehran, but alhamdulillah, now they're fighting in Europe. So maybe this is some time for relax for the Muslim Ummah. This is, in a few words, my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Olsi, for this interesting presentation. So now I'm going to introduce our second speaker for today, Dr. Emir Hadzikadunic. Okay, he was ambassador of Bosnia and Herzegovina to Malaysia. He holds a PhD in international relations from the International University of Sarajevo. His extensive experience in international relations and foreign policy includes professional service as ambassador of Bosnia and Herzegovina to the Islamic Republic of Iran from 2010 to 2013, and Malaysia 2016 to ongoing. Lecturing, he's also lecturing and guest lecturing at the International University of Sarajevo and other universities in Southeast Europe, Malaysia, and Singapore. He has written for academic journals and media outlets, authored 2 books, and co-authored other publications. Throughout his professional career, he has also conducted consultancy work for EU, UNDP, OSCE, and USAID during their peace-building missions in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He is currently a distinguished fellow at Faculty of Administrative Science and Policy Studies, Universiti Teknologi Malaysia, adjunct lecturer of international relations at the University of Sarajevo School of Science and Technology in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and visiting fellow at Istanbul Tikaret University in Turkey. So now I would like to invite Dr. Emir for his presentation.
Thank you very much. Just to confirm, you hear me well?
Yes, Dr. Emir, we can hear you very clear.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. My salams and greetings to everyone. Well, first of all, I would like to highlight that my reflection to this webinar question will be within the School of International Relations and 2 competing theories. So on that note, I have to respectfully disagree with the question of this debate, especially with the word aggression. To me, this is a bit biased. It is neither fair nor objective, because it already implies that the West, or better say NATO, was an aggressor, that the West forced Central and Eastern European countries by tanks to join either EU or NATO. The simple fact is and remains that NATO's eastward expansion was an expression of the popular will by all those nations. They have chosen themselves to be part of liberal, institutional, and rules-based order in Europe. But I understand the logic of this question. That logic would have been better reflected with the following inquiry. Was Russian invasion of Ukraine the result of NATO's expansion eastward? That would be more fair, more objective, would be factually right, and certainly not biased. Okay, semantic aside, I think that within international relations realm, we cannot deal with this topic systematically enough. We cannot deal with this topic consistently enough without a theory, without relevant theoretical framework, without related theoretical assumptions. At the very heart of Russia's intervention in Ukraine, or better say invasion, which is the first part of your first question, is the notion of security. So the security is the key notion. At the very heart of NATO's expansion eastward, which is the second part of your first question, is the notion of collective security. So these two notions, security and collective security, they belong to competing theories of international relations. So to answer this webinar question logically, methodologically, systematically, objectively, was Russian intervention in Ukraine the result of NATO expansion? We need to consult relevant theories. Then it would be easier, of course, to answer the second part of your question as well. What is the impact on the Muslim world? In this part, I will actually mainly focus on Bosnia and the wider Balkan region. Let me now address two competing frameworks that will help us understand objectively and systematically and methodologically the very essence of Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the first approach, the first theoretical approach that I will use today is about realism, realist logic, and realist assumptions in the field of international relations. At the very heart of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as I said, is the notion of security. Russian security in the light of NATO's expansion eastward. So from a realist point of view, which is also a Russian point of view, NATO was on offensive. Hence, Russia had no other choice but to be on defensive. This is a simple logic of realism. This logic can be a little bit more complicated if we bring in the notion of security dilemma. So supposedly defensive moves, supposedly from NATO's perspective, in Central and Eastern Europe are perceived by Russia as offensive. As a reaction, supposedly defensive moves by Russia in their eyes to increase their own security along its periphery are perceived by US and NATO as offensive, compelling again countervailing actions. So these actions include, for example, US military presence in the Baltics and elsewhere along NATO's eastern border, including the expansion into the southeastern Europe. So this measure by NATO again provoke reactive steps from Moscow, such as rising nuclear alert or taking aggressive positions toward other states, not necessarily in its immediate neighborhood. For example, Russia fanned the flames of internal crisis in the Balkan region as well, which is far beyond its immediate neighborhood. For example, in Montenegro, 2015, 2016, Republic of Northern Macedonia, 2017, 2018, or Bosnia and Herzegovina for the whole decade. So Russia, for example, launched joint military exercise with Serbia in 2021, in 2019 as well, to coincide with the Defender Europe drills by NATO being held in neighboring Balkan countries. So you see a lot of security dilemma around. So as you can see from this realist point of view, security dilemma and security in general explains behavior of key actors quite rationally, quite systematically, and quite logically. It assumes survival in the international system. It does not assume prosperity. It does not assume integration. It does not assume interdependence, and it does not assume collective security. In extreme version of this notion of security, you have the might is right. You have the strong states do what they like, and the weak ones, they suffer what they must. So this is the extreme version of realism, which is again an alternative to liberal notions, alternative to rules-based order, alternative to institutional frameworks, and eventually alternative to collective defense or collective security. So let me now bring neo-realist school of thought, which is, we are still within realism. According to neo-realist scholars, NATO has expanded eastward to threaten Russia in the European subsystem. There is international system, Europe is one subsystem according to structural realist, right? So Russia, according to neo-realist logic, has the right to defend itself, has a right to invade a neighboring country for security considerations. Russia has a right to intervene in Ukraine to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. This is all structural realist logic. In this framework, this is very important. Security concerns of Russia are recognized well, but those security considerations of Ukraine are not recognized at all. According to the structural realism, Ukraine as a sovereign country is not free. I highlight, is not free to pursue its own policy. Ukraine as a sovereign country has no right, I underline, has no right to choose its ally. This is all according to structural realism. Kiev has to consult its elder brother and more powerful neighboring brother, that is Russia. So Ukraine, for that matter, or for that matter, Central and Eastern European countries should recognize their second-class status in the community of nations and accept their geopolitical role as neutral buffer at the edge of Russian great power, which is one option, or living within a zone of Russian sphere of influence, which is their second option. So weaker states in this structural realism, in this neo-realism, in realism in general, have no choice. They have no rights to choose. Rights and freedoms of people of Ukraine are irrelevant in this case. They are deprived of any agency. Ukraine has no agency for that matter. So for hardcore realists today, such as John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, these rights and these freedoms are liberal delusions. This is structural realism logic. So what does it tell us? It tells us that the structural realists who explain the situation in Ukraine from a position of great power politics, they often ignore voices from Ukraine. They often ignore voices from the region, treating these states as object rather than the subject in history. They are treating these states rather as object rather than subject in the international system. Remember, these are all well-founded assumptions from the most influential, intellectually most powerful realist scholars in the West, in the United States of America, generally speaking. They have been telling their story from University of Chicago, University of Harvard, all over the US. They have been telling this story for the last 8 years, since Russian occupation of Crimea. Now, you have many other intellectuals from other orientations, even opposite ones, from all over the world, who defend Russia's position from the realist perspective, even though they hate realism, they hate great power politics, but still they defend Russian position from the logic of realism because they find strong reasoning over there. To sum up this school, to sum up this realist notion, Mearsheimer and other realist scholars generally raise three interrelated assumptions. Their first assumption goes as follows. As America's primacy gradually declines with the rise of China, its grand strategy, US grand strategy of liberal hegemony in Europe, and this is the term coined by structural realists, liberal hegemony, should also dissolve, including its institutional lag of collective security in Europe, to which the US has given too much and received too little in return, according to them. The US, their argument goes, should gradually reduce its military presence in Europe and turn NATO over to Europeans, and turn European security to Europeans, and then focus on East Asia, which is the prime dilemma and prime threat for the US. The second assumption from neo-realist school it goes as follows. A Euro-Atlantic liberal order generated more problems than solutions in the post-Cold War period. NATO expansion beyond the Iron Curtain, NATO expansion eastward poisoned relations with Russia and provoked unnecessary tensions in Georgia 2008 and then Ukraine 2014 and 2022. And their third assumption is that Russia is not a big threat to European security, as it is generally portrayed or perceived in the US and across the Europe. For that matter, even though these professors are 99% from the US, Moscow, according to them, is driven more by defensive aims, or so at least the Moscow claims. So balancing between Russia and European states on one hand and restrain US foreign policy on the other hand is a better way forward for everyone, according to neo-realist scholars. So if we are to assume this logic is correct, this logic is right, then those who still prefer liberal, institutional, rules-based order are wrong. My question is, are they wrong? And while this question is in the air, let me deal with opposing theory, which is liberalism, just to be, again, methodological, systematic, and objective. At the very heart of NATO's expansion, as I said, eastward, is the principle of collective security. At the very heart of NATO's founding treaty is the principle of collective defense, collective security. So it remains a unique and enduring principle that binds its members together, committing them to protect each other and setting a spirit of solidarity within the alliance, within all member states that are part of NATO. So according to this liberalism, any European state is free to choose, I highlight, whether or not it will join alliance. According to liberal perspective, Ukraine as a sovereign state has a right to choose its ally. It has freedom to join NATO if its government and its people in majority wish to do so. Remember, realism does not allow those rights and those freedom. These are delusions for them. That is why these two theories are opposite to each other. So NATO members also decide whether or not any applicant country is eligible for the membership based on the rules of the club. Sometimes NATO's final decision could also be based on political or security considerations. And Ukraine is the best case. My country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, is another. So this is not one-sided, it is always a two-sided process. Second, NATO is a rules-based organization. All member states share certain values. They are all liberal democracies. They have free and fair elections. They all respect rule of law. Yes, there are some democratic deficiencies within very few NATO members, such as Hungary or Poland, but still, authoritarian, undemocratic, illiberal state could not join NATO. They could not apply for membership because they do not satisfy, they do not fulfill basic criteria. So liberalism as a theory in IR has three major schools that encourage peace, that encourage cooperation among states. Let me share two of these schools just briefly because they reflect this question of webinar. So the first school of thought is democratic peace theory, which in short means well-established democracies do not fight other well-established democracies. In other words, democracies tend to see each other as legitimate and as unthreatening and therefore have higher capacity for cooperation with each other than they do have with other non-democracies. Statistical analysis provides some support, some say strong support, for democratic peace theory. Peace in Europe, at least among states that share democratic values since 1945, is a good example. And second school of thought is liberal institutionalism. So states willingly come together and establish international organizations, establish regional organizations. States willingly establish common institutions with a set of common rules that states agree to obey. Common rules help create a common order. The EU and NATO is again the best example of liberal institutionalism, examples of states coming together to integrate their economies, to create a collective security, to protect themselves collectively. Some may ask, some may still ask, why the EU and why the NATO could not make a compromise with Russia and accept Russian request that Ukraine stay out of NATO or stay out of the EU. Well, the answer to this question lies in the very essence of liberalism, in the very essence of this theoretical notion. The EU and NATO as liberal notions cannot compromise the autonomy of an aspiring member, such as Ukraine, especially in a deal with a revisionist great power. This would undermine their liberal order. This would undermine the order that they want to defend. In a liberal story, NATO expansion eastward was never perceived as an aggressive act from their point of view. It was never supposed to threaten Russia, again, from their point of view. It was about economic prosperity of all member states. It was about their collective security. It was about their collective defense of all those member states that are part of this structure and who share the same domestic order, liberal democracy and rule of law and common institutions. For liberals, this is not just semantics. For states beyond the Iron Curtain, the West has been desired political direction associated with those elements, with prosperity, with democracy, despite many limitations of the liberal democracies worldwide. So having authoritarian Russia as an alternative ideological option, many East Europeans looked forward to membership to the EU, look forward to membership to NATO as a means to secure their freedom, to secure their liberties, and eventually to secure their sovereignty. So the EU and NATO could not have expanded into Eastern Europe had the Eastern European states not wanted it, had they not actively pursued that vision. One can still question, why is European and Euro-Atlantic integration so attractive? So to answer this question, let me share some other benefits from historical perspective. First, mechanism of collective security, this liberal notion, has provided many system-wide benefits in Western Europe during the Cold War. For example, American military presence in Europe has made peace between long-term enemies, France and Germany, who fought 3 bloody wars throughout their recent history with the lasting and far-reaching consequences. Western Europe has enjoyed uninterrupted peace, uninterrupted prosperity, and uninterrupted economic integration since 1945. Without American military presence in Western Europe, in Germany in particular, without its security guarantees, the creation of the European Union would have not been possible. This is all liberal notions. At the same time, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe were under direct or indirect Soviet control. States like Hungary, states like Czechoslovakia, like Poland, although nominally independent, were not free to pursue their own policy, either domestic or foreign. Remember what happened to Hungary in 1956? What happened to Czechoslovakia in 1968? These countries were invaded by the Soviet Union when they tried to divert from Moscow prescribed course. from Moscow prescribed authoritarian course. This was their historical experience under authoritarian, under communist, under illiberal great power. On the contrary, no liberal European state in the post-World War II era has ever felt any military threat from the US. Hence, the right question is not why NATO expanded, but why Central and Eastern European countries continued to fear Russia, not the US. So NATO enlargement has also been a net positive. On security ground, in the post-Cold War period, the US benevolent leadership stood shoulder to shoulder with Germans seeking freedom and reunification in the 1990s. New members of the EU and NATO have also enjoyed peace and stability for the past 30 years. All members enjoyed peace and stability and prosperity for the past 30 years. Their economies have largely prospered and their political systems have largely liberalized, despite recent authoritarian tendencies, as I said, in Hungary and Poland. For liberal school, it is not surprising that Russian foreign policy attracted limited support from the former Soviet republics and other Eastern and Central European states. Most of those states continue to fear Russia. Unlike their attraction with the liberal world, generally the West, their anxiety toward Moscow can be explained from their shared national memory of what can happen under the rule of authoritarian hegemon, illiberal hegemon. Let us put other Central and Eastern European states on the side, and let us focus now on Ukraine for a while. Again, it is not surprising that Russia attracted limited support in many Russian-speaking areas in Ukraine. I highlight Russian-speaking areas in Ukraine. EU membership was always more popular there than joining Russia's Euro-Asian Economic Union. That's the fact. You can check the census. As we speak now, the more Russian-speaking cities of Kharkiv and Mariupol in Ukraine, they bravely resist Russian onslaught. Citizens of Kherson, again, majority-speaking Russian city, they have not welcomed Russian troops. They went to the street of their occupied city to wave Ukrainian flags in front of Russian tanks. Remember, at the very heart of liberalism is the notion of freedom. It is the notion of people's agency that is being denied in Ukraine. Okay, now I will move to the second part of your webinar question. What is the impact on the Muslim world? I will actually focus on Bosnia in particular. And again, I will deal from, to be again more objective, more systematic and more methodological, I will deal within two opposing theories. So I raise two following questions. What happens within Bosnia when liberal approach prevails, when EU and NATO have unquestioned authority, and what happened within Bosnia or the wider Balkan region when realist approach prevails, when European geopolitics is back, when Russia makes geopolitical U-turn, including Balkan. So what happened with those small and vulnerable countries, including Bosnia and other countries in the Balkan region that have Muslim majority or minority? So first I will deal with a liberal approach. So NATO and EU, again, two liberal kind of, that reflect liberal notions, they have been a net positive when it comes to security in the Balkans in general, and Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular after 1995. I highlight this now, after 1995. Yes, before that, that year they were quite inactive and they could not prevent genocide that happened in Srebrenica in Bosnia in July 1995. Second, American-led liberal order eventually successfully brokered the Dayton Peace Agreement. It was them, not anybody else, in 1995. Its leadership has also managed to finally contain the outbreak of nationalism and violence in the region in the late 1990s. It prevented actually another genocide in Kosovo, as they learned their lesson in Bosnia from genocide in Srebrenica. by direct military intervention in 1999. And they saved many Muslim lives. Many Albanians' lives have been saved in Kosovo as a result of US intervention based on those liberal notions. So throughout this initial post-Dayton phase, in Bosnia in particular, NATO and EU, they have offered system-wide benefits, and they have patiently put in place new structures and new policies so that a war-torn country can move forward in the peace process. NATO and EU largely followed the dictates of liberal notions to strengthen the rule of law, strengthen democracy, and strengthen institutions. So NATO-led missions in Bosnia, there are two paths, civilian mission and military missions. So these two military missions, I4 implementation force and S4 stabilization force, they have deterred threats to peace and security in Bosnia from 1995 to 2004, when they were closed. They have secured refugees to return. They have trained and restructured armed forces of Bosnia. They have helped civilian authorities and international agencies toward a common goal. For example, key indicators of the success of the I4 mission from 1995 to 1997 were the first post-war election in Bosnia and the safe return of 200,000 displaced people and refugees. By the end of S4 mission in 2004, a single Ministry of Defense, a single chain of command, and unified armed forces of Bosnia and Herzegovina were established from three opposing armed forces that fiercely fought each other in early 1990s. Next, the EU offered membership perspective to countries of the Southeastern Europe, including Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo as well, as an added value to these military missions. The EU roadmap highlighted generally the process of change that included adaptation to various EU standards, again in areas of democracy, rule of law, internal market, freedom of movements of goods, capital, and all that. Through this EU leverage, reforms in Bosnia's key sector that were underway in judiciary, in economy, in border security, in public broadcasting, just to name a few, resulted in the formation of new state institutions that increased stability, that strengthened rule of law, that strengthened transparency and a free market. Bosnia as a state after the bloody war has strengthened a weak state government from 3 ministries in 1996 after the Dayton Peace Agreement to more functional cabinet of 10 ministries in 2003. So it is not a coincidence that this golden phase of the post-war recovery of Bosnia and many other Muslim minority and majority countries have overlapped with historic expansion of EU and NATO eastward toward Central and Eastern Europe from late 1990s to 2004. This liberal unipolarity, if we can call it that way, within Europe and enthusiasm for integration helped motivate local Bosnian constituencies, Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Croats, and Bosnian Muslims to accept conditions for peace set out by the Dayton Peace Agreement. For example, Dragan Čavić, he was a then president of a Bosnian Serb majority entity. He made, for example, a public apology for Srebrenica genocide in 2004, calling it the black page in Serbian history. This is what he said in 2004. Well, the language today is different, and I will explain you why. By 2004, half of Bosnia's 500,000 destroyed homes were rebuilt, and some 200,000 disputed properties were effectively given back to people who had been forced to flee their homes during the wartime. It is a stunning achievement in the light of lawless conditions that prevailed when this process began in 1996. So all these achievements in Bosnia were so remarkable that different commentators, including your author today, celebrate a successful Bosnian passage from the phase of Dayton to the phase of Brussels. Institutes like Brookings from the US also regarded lessons in Bosnia to emulate and apply in other war-torn countries. All these reforms in Bosnia happened within a liberal framework, within a liberal rules-based and institutional Euro-Atlantic order in Europe. All these happened when NATO and EU were strong players in Bosnia, when they had unquestioned authority and when they had support from within. But then guess what happened when realist framework took over, when Russia penetrates the Balkans and Bosnia, which is far beyond their immediate neighborhood, which does not reflect their security concerns. What happens when with Russia's U-turn in European geopolitics? So generally speaking, Kremlin is not hiding its interest to replace an existing liberal order, primarily the one extended beyond the Iron Curtain, with favorable and less democratic European regimes that fit Russia's image, including the Balkans. Russia is not hiding its interest to replace an existing liberal order in Europe with some unknown and certainly more anarchic multipolar structure with sphere of influence. So who is affected? Only young democracies and vulnerable countries scattered around the European periphery. They have become more divided and eventually more anarchic. Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, has been in a peaceful deadlock for the last 10 years, thanks to Russian proxies in Bosnia. It went largely unnoticed that Bosnian Serb leader today has held at least 10 official consultations with Vladimir Putin in last several years. Last meeting happened just weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine. And guess what happened along the way of those meetings? Russian proxy in Bosnia threatened to reverse key reforms, democratic reforms undertaken in the immediate post-Dayton phase. Russian proxy in Bosnia threatened to withdraw, for example, Serb soldiers out of the country's unified military. It vowed to demolish mutually agreed and legally binding dynamics for achieving collective peace, collective security. Like leaderships in Donbass and South Ossetia, Russian proxy in Bosnia also expressed secessionist tendencies. Addressing RS National Assembly in 2020, 2 years ago, Milorad Dodik, Bosnian Serb leader, he provokingly declared, I quote him, "Goodbye Bosnia, welcome RS exit." So what was going on when Ukraine crisis was about to erupt? Well, pro-Russian elements have doubled down on efforts to tear apart the post-war constitutional order of the country's two constituent entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Republika Srpska. In December 2021, just few months ago, lawmakers loyal to Dodik, they advanced their secessionist bid and voted in favor of starting a procedure for Republika Srpska to withdraw from central government, from common defense, from common judiciary, from common intelligence, just to name a few. They have also decided that within 6 months, and this is the period of now, we are living those 6 months in Bosnia, and we are so worried about these 6 months. The government in Banja Luka must recreate its own legislation governing such institutions. To show they mean business, Republika Srpska paraded paramilitary forces on January 9 this year in a nationalist celebration declared illegal by the Bosnian Constitutional Court. Among participants were the Night Wolves, a black uniform group of Russian nationalist pro-Kremlin bikers. On February 10, the last month, Republika Srpska National Assembly adopted the draft version of the law to create a separate judicial system from the rest of the state. So regarding his future plans, Milorad Dodik said he won't be daunted by opposition from the West, from the liberal world, suggesting that Moscow will help if the West imposes sanctions. He is the guy who praised realism, by the way, and all those realist notions. And this is the result of realism in Bosnia. In conclusion, it appears from my talk today that strong American liberal leadership in Europe and effective EU agenda in the Balkans are major factors of stability, not only in my country, but major factors of stability in the Southeastern Europe. They are still, in other words, their withdrawal could constitute a rapid change that could trigger a conflict breaking out. So should they leave Bosnia altogether, NATO and EU they are still present, which is less probable, other extra-regional actors will be invited to fill the vacuum, in which case power relations would inevitably become a subject to reconfiguration, and different visions for both Bosnia and Southeastern Europe would have to emerge. I'm talking about those states that have not been integrated yet to the NATO and the EU. And I will finally end my talk with a prayer of Bosnian Grand Mufti Hussein Efendi Kavazovic. This is what he said in his recent Friday ceremony, and I quote him: "We pray to God Almighty that he protects the people of Ukraine who are victims of oppression and injustice. It was indeed an extraordinary moment in the history of Friday prayers in Bosnia. This moment, more than anything else, tells the story on which side Bosnian Muslims are. The reasons for such a choice are quite obvious." I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emir, for this very informative and energetic presentation. Before, I take questions from the audience. If Dr. Olsi would like to respond to some of the points made by Dr. Emir, please do so.
Yes, I like the presentation of Dr. Emir, even though it was mainly from a theoretical point of view. Anyhow, I just wanted to make a few historical clarifications. I mean, many countries in Europe, they didn't join NATO out of their own will, but many were coerced to join it. I will give some examples. Albania, for example, joined NATO, but we had no referendum. In 2018, Macedonia, which was forced to even change its name into Northern Macedonia, was asked to make a referendum if people wanted to join NATO, and only 36% of the people voted, which means that the overwhelming majority of Macedonians, they refused to join NATO. And I mean, there are many countries in Europe who historically have seen NATO as an aggressive power, a power that we have to specify doesn't serve to the members of NATO, but serves only to the Anglo-American interests and domination in Europe. An example, we have Turkey, one of the oldest members of NATO, who in 2012, when it was attacked by Syria, the poor Turks, they invoked the 5th article of NATO, but NATO didn't come to the help of Turkey. So for people who want to see the history based on facts, they know that NATO serves to the Anglo-American domination of Europe and not to a common security. We had a clear example of what happened to Turkey. Turkey was attacked by Syria, and the Americans told to them, you know what, we don't care what happens to you. We are here only to serve to our own interests. Now, regarding the Russian intervention in Ukraine, I think that it is not very much different from what NATO did to Kosovo under the breaking of the international law that the Americans invented after the fall of the Soviet Union, the so-called R2P, or right to protect. They intervened against the international law, even though I'm an Albanian. And of course, I'm happy that NATO, in a way, protected my own people. But from a legal point of view, NATO broke the international law. So Russia, with its intervention in Ukraine, is following the NATO standard when they bombed Libya, and they sent Libya to the Stone Age in 2011 by butchering the people of Sirte under the excuse that they wanted to defend the people of Benghazi, and they killed even the leader of Libya. So I mean, what Ukraine is doing in Donbass, after all, is in a way it is following in the footsteps of what the Americans have done in order to make sure that Israel will survive and will become the dominant power over Islam, and will humiliate the Palestinians in the long term in the Middle East. And then when it was mentioned that under the NATO and EU umbrella, we have democracies. Well, for me, who come from Balkans, I don't see any democracy. We saw how the Americans made a coup d'etat in Pristina, Kosovo in 2020. They ousted from power Prime Minister Albin Kurti when he refused to sign Trump's normalization agreement with Serbia, where, among others, the Americans openly dictated to the government of Kosovo to be the first traitor Muslim country to open a Muslim embassy in Jerusalem. In few words, to give Masjid al-Aqsa to the Zionist invaders. So, I mean, when we speak about NATO bringing democracy, I think this is a myth. We see what the Americans are doing now in Albania, in Macedonia, in Bosnia. They are organizing coups for people who follow what happens in Albania. We have massive voter fraud, and we have the Soros Foundation, which decides, and the US Embassy, and these are open things. I mean, it is such a shameful for what the Americans are doing to democracy, at least in Eastern Europe and in countries in the Balkans, where if you want to be a politician, you have to be in good terms with the US ambassador, because unless she likes you, she can declare you a person non grata. At this very moment, we have Salih Berisha, the head of the opposition party in Albania, who has been declared non grata, and the Americans come and dictate and tell to him, you should not run for elections. Can we imagine the US Embassy to do the same thing in other countries outside of the Balkans? It is unimaginable what they are doing. And now something that was raised, that was presented before was, what is the thing that is pushing people of Eastern Europe to want to join the EU integration? I think there are two separate things, the EU integration from the NATO integration. By the way, I'm a student of the European University Institute, which is in a way the official university of the European Union. And for people who know how the EU functions, they say, they have a saying that the greatest enemy of the EU is the Americans, but we cannot do anything against them. Now, why countries like Albania, Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia, Kosovo, even Ukraine want to join NATO? Simple, because of money. I mean, the reason why I'm teaching in Kuala Lumpur and I'm not in Tirana is because our economies have been destroyed in Eastern Europe. After 1990s, the Americans made with us what they made with Ukraine, the so-called shock therapy, massive privatization, closure of factories, destruction of economy. There are many works, even PhD theses. We show, for example, what the Americans did after their intervention in Kosovo. Kosovo had so many factories, and it was a developed socialist country. And one of the things that Americans did after intervening and invading Kosovo, because Kosovo is not an independent state, by the way, they destroyed the socialist economy. Kosovars were producing everything from car tires to shoes and what have you. And after their intervention, they did what they did even in Ukraine, the so-called shock therapy. We have to destroy the economies of these people, and then these people will run away. Since the American capture of Eastern Europe, we have been depopulated. Nowadays, the population of Albania was to be around 3.5 million. In Albania, we have only 1.5 million, around 2 million have left. And not only us, but all people of Eastern Europe. You start from Ukraine to Serbia, you'll find us in Germany, in Italy, in United Kingdom, in Canada, in United States, because what the Americans did is they made an economic devastation of Eastern Europe. This is not that I want to defend the Russians here, but this is the reality. And the problem is that Americans, especially since the fall of communism, have in a way subdued Europe. We had many European politicians in the early 2000s, the example of Romano Prodi in Italy, who wanted to remove the US bases from Aviano, because many Europeans, they do not want to take part in NATO's wars against Russia, Ukraine, and whatever. And what happened when Prodi wanted to remove the American bases from Italy. The US ambassador went and blackmailed him and showed him the surrender agreement that Italy has with the United States since the Second World War. The same thing happens with Germany. Poor Germany today is the cow which is being milked by the Anglo-Americans to pay for the wars that Israel, United States does in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, in Ukraine. We have millions of Syrians. So after the Americans and the proxies that they sponsored destroyed Syria, Iraq, and Libya, and Afghanistan, who have ended up in Germany. It is poor Germany who is paying the bill and who is now going to host probably even like 2, maybe even 5 million Ukrainians. And one of the reasons why many Ukrainians are leaving Ukraine in this moment and going toward Germany, it is not because of Putin. It is because finally they can get a residency permit in Germany, so they can escape from poverty. I have lived in Europe for many years, and I know how poor Ukrainians are since the fall of Soviet Union, a country which was very prosperous during time of Soviet Union. They were producing from the Antonov to even many rockets, and the major steel industry of Soviet Union was in Ukraine. What they did is that they destroyed Eastern Europe under the name of liberalism, but this liberal order is anti-Islamic and anti-Christian. I mean, they promote homosexuality, they destroy religion. For people who study the situation of Muslim communities in the Balkans. Let's start from Macedonia to Kosovo to Albania. I mean, they are not allowing even Muslims to profess their religion. They made huge war when Kosovo was created as a state, not to allow Islam to become part of the constitution of Kosovo. So they are slowly but surely raising the Islamic identity of Muslims, but even of Christians. I mean, we see what the games that they're doing against the Orthodox Church. The thing is that I believe that the so-called liberal order is a myth. As a historian, I pretend better to analyze the facts. And something that is very important is that there is a rising Americanophobia throughout Europe. But the problem is, like we can see, for example, you cannot post anything against the sanctions against Russia on Facebook because your Facebook will be closed. We're having Russian medias like Sputnik, like Russia Today, removed out from the air. And on the other hand, for us coming from the Muslim background and Muslim world, we know what NATO did to Libya, to Afghanistan, what Americans, including even Ukrainians and Poles who joined them, what they made to Iraqis. They destroyed the Islamic civilization in the Middle East. And nowadays, when Americans, tell us that we're fighting for democracy in Ukraine, come on. I mean, if we compare the facts, what Russians are doing in Donbass is exactly what Americans did in Kosovo. They went to so-called protect us, the Kosovars, Albanian Muslims, not because they love Allah and Muhammad, but because of their geopolitical calculations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Olsi. Dr. Emir, yes, please. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, share your perspective on this.
Well, I agree that Americans are not always good guys. They are occasionally bad guys as well, and no question about this. But the fact remains that all these countries in Central and Eastern Europe are not attracted to join Russia, but they are attracted to join the US. This is one. I just shared with you some latest data on support in some of these countries to join NATO. So this is the data, PEV Research Center data shows that Eastern European members generally see the NATO favorably. 53% of Czechs have positive opinion about NATO. 77% of Lithuanians see NATO as a positive role. NATO's most enthusiastic supporters are people in Poland, 88%. 88% support the alliance. 53% of Ukrainians, they view NATO favorably as well, compared to 23% who view it negatively in this census. In my country, Bosnia, support is above 50%, and I'm sure in all other Balkan region countries, including Albania and Kosovo. When I was in Albania the last year, I have seen only two flags there, Albanian and the US flag. Almost every house on the Albanian coast have two flags, US flag and American flag. And my colleague, Dr. Olsi, can confirm this one.
No, Dr. Emir, you are right. Most of drug dealers, because they want to scare off the police, they usually put the American flag. Even our corrupt politicians, because they
I don't know. I don't know who they are. I don't know who they are, but I see every household.
They use the US flag as a kind of haimali, you know, the nuska. When you write Quran and you put in your pocket to defend you from shaitan, they use it in the same way in the Balkans.
Maybe, but this was on the massive scale. I saw it in poor houses and big houses as well. And my final point is on Germany. It is a historic fact that Germany would not have been reunited without support from the US. You know who was against reunification? UK and France. And who insisted that this finally eventually happened? It was the US liberal leadership. And Dr. Olsi also mentioned that poor Germans are like paying something. You forget to tell that Germans have been paying less than 2% of agreed defense budget for their defense. So it is not them who is paying for their security, not Germans. These are tens of billions of US dollars. It is Americans, taxpayers, who are paying to protect Germany or to protect Europe. So Germany has been able to save a lot of money to think about economy because it was not paying 2% that has been agreed upon. They paid much less, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. It was a little bit rising. And now, as a result of this intervention in Ukraine, they finally decide to pay 2%, which is around 100 billion German, 100 billion euros. So Germany, you can imagine how many billions, hundreds of billions Germany has saved from early 90s till this point in these 30 years by not paying for security, by relying on American taxpayers. So this is another fact that I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Emir. Yeah, Dr. Olsi, do you have any last words on this before I move on to take questions from the audience?
No, just a specification. I mean, the reason why Germany didn't spend on the military is because it is a defeated nation, and the Treaty of Surrender doesn't allow Germany to have a military. Poor Germans, they produce submarines, nuclear submarines for Israel. They produce weapons for Israel, but they don't have submarines. All this big Germany gives to Muslims and Arabs, but I think they have only 2 diesel submarines, if I'm not wrong, because they're not allowed. And even now that they are rearming is because the Americans told them you have to rearm because we want to use you to fight the Russians. The problem is that Germany is treated like Italy as well. For those people who know the surrender treaties that the Americans made with them, they are treated in Europe like enemy powers, at the same way how Germany was treated by France and the UK and the Americans after World War I. They are a defeated power. And the reason why Mama Merkel says we will receive 1 million Syrians and now they will probably receive 2 to 4 million Ukrainians is because they have to pay for what Israelis and Anglo-Americans do in the world. It is a defeated country. It's not a free country, Germany. We have to.
Thank you, Dr. Olsi. Yeah, so now let me take some questions from the audience. So who is this big bad guy responsible for this Ukraine-Russian conflict? Yeah, so far, is it Russia? Is it NATO? Is it EU? Is it the US? Is it the Zionists? Okay, so as we move on with this debate, yep, so let's take some questions from the audience here. So we have one question from Chi Kyung Tan, and this question is for Dr. Olsi. If Kiev is Jerusalem for Russia, so is Russia also a protector for Ukraine in the Eastern Europe or Slavic world, like how the US protects Israel in the Middle East or Muslim world?
Yes, Russia perceives Ukraine as its own sphere of influence, and it is moreover its culture. I mean, like we Muslims see Jerusalem as part of our civilization, and we do not feel good when we see Israelis violating the Muslims in Jerusalem. Russians feel the same. And after all, what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine, he's following the so-called Monroe Doctrine of the Americans. I mean, Americans made so many coups d'etats in Latin America. They made coups in Argentina, in Chile, in Colombia, you name it. They killed presidents and ministers during the Cold War because the Monroe Doctrine was that we are not going to allow the Russians to come to North America. And imagine what would the Americans have done if Russia would have made a coup d'etat in Ottawa and have installed a Russian as the head of the government of Canada and made biological laboratories and send weapons to Canada. It would have been World War III without a doubt. This is what Americans are doing, and I think that the problem of the conflicts that we have nowadays in the world, and in particular the conflict in Ukraine, it is American expansionism and NATO. I mean, we Europeans, we don't need wars. And look, because we have to divide something between the Anglo-Americans, which they are an oceanic empire. I mean, if whenever war happens in Europe, the Americans, they go in ships and they go back to their islands. And who pays the price is us, the Europeans. So we Europeans have no interest for the Anglo-Americans and Israelis to burn the Middle East, because it is, after all, the French, Italian, German taxpayers who will pay for the Syrians and the Afghans and Iraqis who will go to Berlin and Paris and who will not work and who will destroy the social welfare. And moreover, we don't need a war in Ukraine. I mean, why should the Americans have made a coup, first of all, in 2014, removing the democratically elected president of the country, when the people want them? Ukrainians are Russian speakers. I mean, they're like Indonesians and Malaysians. They are the same religion, the same culture. And now you have a foreign power which comes, makes a coup and says, no, we don't want the government of, let us say, Jakarta, because they are friendly to Kuala Lumpur, and I'm going to bring my own government. I mean, it is a foreign intervention. And I mean, NATO and the EU are two separate things. Now, it was not bad for us in Eastern Europe. We had guaranteed jobs, free housing, free healthcare. We in Albania were not that good, but our friends in Yugoslavia, they had a great life. But what happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union? We all escaped. If you go to Toronto nowadays, you'll find so many Ukrainians with PhD in nuclear who work as taxi drivers. Or you'll find the personal pilot of Tito who works as a taxi driver in Toronto. What the fall of communism brought to us in Eastern Europe brought destruction, devastation, and mass depopulation. And this serves to the grand chessboard game that Americans do with Russians. I'm not saying here that Russians are better. We know the crimes that Russia have done in Chechnya and in many other countries. But the best thing for us Europeans, I think, will be to keep Russians and Americans out and to live in peace. I mean, we Europeans have a different culture. I mean, we are not very aggressive people. We are not, I mean, when Americans bombed Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan, if you, in the time I was in Italy, you'll see the Italian public, how much they hate the Americans. I remember in the time when the Americans were coming to hotels in Florence, they were saying, sorry, we're not with Bush, we're Democrats, because they were feeling guilty and ashamed by the hatred that Europeans have towards what aggressions Americans do in the world. And now in Ukraine, who's paying the bill? It is us, the Europeans. We in the Balkans, when we eat bread, our grain comes from Russia, in Albania, in Egypt, in United Arab Emirates. Look at they're not putting any embargo on Russia. Okay, Russia is fighting with Ukraine, then why should the Americans force us to sanction Russia? They're fighting, so it's their job. Let us say Australia is going to fight with New Zealand one day. It doesn't concern us. I mean, NATO and NATO propagandists, they speak of common security, blah, blah, blah. I mean, Italians are not being threatened by the Russians. Of course, we have the Poles, we have the Czechs, we have these reactionary Baltic republics who have Russian minorities and they feel threatened by the Russians because of their historical problems with the Russians. They do feel threatened, like the Taiwanese feel threatened by the Chinese. But if China goes to war with Taiwan, why should we in Europe suffer because of it? And now we are suffering now because our food is going up, our gasoline is going up, and people have no food to eat. There are people are protesting. If you can see in Albania, in Macedonia, in Greece as well, people are protesting because we are so much dependable on Russia. And after all, if we use the mentality of the Cold War, when we had the powerful Soviet Union fighting with the United States, it was excellent for Muslim countries. Mahathir Mohamad, your famous prime minister, I remember when I was a student here, when NATO, the Cold War, we had traitors and to shift the blocks. So when we had the Cold War, countries like Albania, like Algeria, like Syria, like Libya, like Iraq, we were independent. Because the Americans didn't dare to bomb us like the Russians as well. But now what happened with the unipolar world, the American became this international gendarme. And moreover, Israelis, they couldn't massacre the Palestinians like they did after the fall of the Soviet Union. Because we have to remind our viewers that whenever Egypt or Syria was fighting or Iraq was fighting with the Israelis to defend the Palestinians, because we Muslims did with Israel exactly what Russia is doing in Donbass. Russia entered in Donbass to defend its own Orthodox Russians. When Jordan or Syria or Iran intervene in Palestine, we do intervene to defend our own people. It is the right to protect. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Olsi. Yeah, so now I have a question from, again, from Chi Kyung-tan. This one is for Dr. Emir. According to realist theory, will China dominate Nusantara, like how the US dominates the Muslim world in the Middle East and how Russia dominates the Slavic world?
Yeah, this is a structural, this is a systemic question. And all this talk is about structural realism. This war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine is also a structural war. It is the war for the future order. The possible conflict between rising China and ruling US on the other side is again a structural war. It is the war for the order. What kind of the world order we will have in the future? So analogy is very important. This war in Europe, there are two options. Russia is not fighting the Ukraine. This is the minor issue. They are taking, I mean, this territory in the immediate neighborhood, this Donbass and all that, this is the minor issue. The prime issue is the order of Europe. And the Russian aim, the Russian goal is the multipolarity, is the sphere of influence. They like to have Germany one pole, France another pole, Turkey another pole, and Russia fourth pole. And then there is balancing behavior, balance of power. This is Russian vision. They like to dominate not only Russia, but they'd like to dominate the Eastern Europe. They want to have multipolarity. They are not happy with the existing liberal unipolarity, where you have liberal hegemon. US is also hegemon, but this is a liberal hegemon. Russia is authoritarian hegemon. It is realist kind of story. But analogy again is very important. We have First World War and we have Second World War in Europe. What kind of the order did we have before First World War and Second World War? We have European multipolarity. There are primordial fears. Germans are fearful of France. France is in fear of Germany. Turkey is in fear of France. Everybody is fearing each other. If Americans withdraw, you have a bloody war in Europe again. This is the story. And this is what Russians want. They are not after Ukraine. They are after future European order. They like the whole Europe to fight each other. Germans to fight France, Turkey to fight France, Serbia to fight Bosnia, Croatia fight Serbia. It is a multipolar order, is anarchic. Theory has proven it many times. And the First World War and the Second World War are the best examples. So this is the goal of Russia. Now China. Well, China is a rising power. And now we are talking about the international system. This is what's going on in Europe is European subsystem. When we talk about China and the US, we actually talk about the whole international system. Because, Russia is declining power. China is a great power that can confront the US. It cannot be done by Russia. Russia is, as Mersheimer said, a giant gas station. It does not have power. It is declining power in terms of demography, in terms of economy. In the long term, Russia is finished. So they think it's now time for them to change this European order. So when we talk about China, this is international order. And you have two great powers, a ruling power, the US, and the rising power, China. And they are approaching the moment when the rising power would like to take over. This is logical scenario, logical in realism. And there was an excellent book written by Allison, another Harvard realist scholar, Thucydides Trap. He, I think, analyzed all examples in last 400 years where you have these structural wars, when you have a rising power and then you have a ruling power. So in his very prominent study, there was a book at the end, he found out that out of 16 examples of great structural wars, 16 examples of great structural conflicts, 12 of them ended up in a great wars. Only 4 of them ended up peacefully. So there is a great danger that rising China would like to take over, at least East Asia, would like to become a regional hegemon. And the US, by logic, does not tolerate peer competitors. It does not allow China to rule East Asia, does not allow China to project its power here, there, and everywhere. So there is a potential for the conflict. What will happen? Who will rule what? Whether the US will rule the Middle East and China will rule, Southeast Asia, I do not know. But we are approaching this moment when these two great powers, put Russia on the side, will clash. When the ruling power and rising power will have to decide. You have, again, theories that explain this. You have two approaches to this dilemma. Again, liberalism and realism. Realism will tell you they are very pessimistic. They will tell you there will be a great war. Because in 12 out of 16 cases, they don't say they will, they say probably it will happen. Because in 12 out of 16 cases, this is what happened. Liberals will tell you, no, the war will not happen between China and the US. Why is it not going to happen? Because of a strong interdependence. Who is the largest investor in China? One of the top 5 largest investors in China today. Guess which is the country? It's Taiwan. Taiwan and China, their trade is measured by hundreds of billions of dollars. So there is a huge interdependence. So many Chinese people are traveling to Taiwan, and so many Taiwanese are traveling to China. Take, for example, ASEAN. What is their trade with China? How much they rely on China? Take any country from ASEAN. So a liberal school is about interdependence, especially economic interdependence. If you have two countries trading each other, having common investments, traveling to each other places a lot, liberal school of thought will actually predict there will be no war. So this is their kind of logic. What will prevail? Realism or liberalism? I do not know. I'm not certain about this. But certainly, if realism prevails, we have a bloody war. If realism prevails in Europe, again, we have a bloody war. We have a multipolar Europe that can trigger the Third World War. If liberalism prevails, that I pray for, we will have a peace, we will have a lot of trade, we will have a lot of interdependence, and the world will be peaceful. This is my take on this question.
Thank you, Dr. Emir. Yep. Now I will take a question. Well, we have two questions from my counts. Yeah. So, and this question, yeah, is for Dr. Olsi. Yep. Israel is one of the few countries that is on good terms with both Ukraine and Russia. As a result, they very well may be the chosen people for the purpose of mediating a conclusion to this conflict. If that does happen, how would Muslims feel about this? Yeah, there's one more question. I'll ask both questions together. That is there any reason why Muslim majority countries should not form a NATO-style alliance of their own? It seems like they could use a bit more protection from being invaded, and cooperation with an actual military would be a welcome replacement to the ad hoc and illegal movement of militants from uninvolved countries that operate outside the framework of international law. Yes, Dr. Olsi.
I don't think that Israel is in very good relations with Russia. I've been to Moscow, I've been to Russia, I've spoken with many Russian intellectuals. And for the information of our viewers, Russians hate Israel a lot, but they fear Israel a lot. Because the Jewish lobby controls I mean, many sectors of the Russian economy. Many of people who stole Russia in 1990s are Jews, who many of them even escaped to United States and America. And moreover, Russia is a country in a conflict at present with Israel, because Russia turned Syria into a Russian oblast. So, I mean, in a way, Syria is in a way a Russian protectorate. And if you follow Russian media, you will see, and if you see even many Russian politicians, they criticize Israel a lot. So, I mean, Putin tries to play good with Israel because, I mean, he's afraid of them. He's afraid from the influence of the Jewish lobby. But if you talk to Russian philosophers like Alexander Dugin, or many Christian Orthodox clerics, they hate Israel like a hell. They have, in their prophecies, they believe that before the day of Qiyamah, Russia is going to even liberate Jerusalem from the Jews, and Christianity will prevail, and other stories. Now, coming back to the question of the Muslim NATO, the Americans did not allow it, because we had the late Prime Minister of Turkey, Necmettin Erbakan. He even wrote a book on the D8 and his idea of the D8. And his idea was to create a Muslim NATO and to create a Muslim Union with countries from Malaysia to Indonesia, Iran, Nigeria, Turkey, and Iran. But what happened is that the Americans with the army made a coup against him. And moreover, with the Syrian conflict, the Americans, they have implanted a huge conflict between the Sunni and the Shia world. Because, I mean, if we can have a Muslim NATO, that Muslim NATO can be created by the two largest and most powerful countries of Islam, not Indonesia. I'm speaking about the heart of the Muslim world, which are Turkey and Iran. They both have the economic resources and the military know-how to create a real Muslim superpower. But I mean, they do not allow that. And moreover, for people who follow closely the policies of Turkey, the greatest enemy for the Americans in Europe after Russians are the Turks. And a great fear in many political circles after the coming of Biden to power was that Biden was probably going to organize a second coup against Erdogan, like they organized the first one, which failed in 2016, because the Americans and Israelis, they are very unhappy with Erdogan, and their fear is of Turkey becoming a second Iran. And moreover, the latest success of Turkey against Armenia in Azerbaijan, and moreover, even in Ukraine, where Turkish Bayraktar drones are showing how good they are, again, in a conventional war. has made Europe feel very uneasy with Turkey. So the short answer is for as long as the Americans will dominate the world, and for as long as Muslims will be divided into sectarian lines, Sunni, Shia, and what have you, the creation of a Muslim NATO will not be possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Olsi. Yeah, now we have a question for Dr. Emir. The rapid evolution of the war in Ukraine and its horrendous humanitarian consequences caught many of us by surprise. It is true that Crimea will return to Ukrainian hands and referred to Russia's costs incurred by the annexation of the peninsula. As I know, Crimean Tatars have great respect for their culture and never lose it.
So if I understood the question correctly, the question is whether Crimea will return to Ukraine. This is
Yes.
the essence of the question.
Exactly.
Well, I think that Russia will never allow Crimea to be returned back to either Ukraine or to any other country, because this is, I think, of the strategic importance for the Russian security. So from geopolitical and strategic reasons, Russia will, I think, fight to the very end to keep the Crimea with itself. Because alternative, from Russian point of view, if Ukraine gets back Crimea, and if Ukraine becomes one day a NATO member, then NATO ships will be on Crimea, and this is just next to the Russian border. This is from geopolitical, from realist, neo-realist structural reason, from Russian point of view, not feasible, not possible. I think they will, for them, this is the core interest, the core national interest to preserve Crimea. And Ukraine alone has no power to bring it back. So I think it is not even on the agenda of their dialogue at the moment. When they negotiate the peace, I think Russians are not even ready to discuss about that issue. So it is less likely, it is almost not possible that Crimea will be given back to Ukraine. Probably in some future deal between these two countries, if it ever happens, Ukraine will maybe allow some kind of transitional kind of solution, whereby maybe another referendum with maybe some OSCE observation will be held, some transition, and then eventually it will become Russian in reality. So it's not feasible. It's not possible that Crimea is given back to Ukraine. I don't think so.
Thanks, Dr. Emir. One more question for you.
Sorry, if I can just
yes,
make
Dr. if you want to add something, yes.
A historical note. As far as I know, the only international agreement that Russia has about Ukraine is with Turkey, the Treaty of Küçükçayırcı, where it is written that Crimea will be taken in possession by Russia, and if it detaches itself from Russia, it can join Turkey again. But this was with the Ottoman Empire. And as far as I know, there is no other legal binding agreement for the future of Crimea. And I mean, as Dr. Emir just mentioned, I mean, Crimea is so vital for the very existence of Russia as a European naval superpower. Without Crimea, they're gone.
Yeah, if I may also add, as a result of this crisis between Russia and Ukraine, the position of Turkey, geopolitical position of Turkey in Europe has strengthened a lot. So you see what Turkey is doing. They are selling drones to Ukraine. They're having very close relationship with the Ukrainian government. At the same time, they are not imposing sanctions on Russia. So Russia now depends on Turkey more than Turkey depends on Russia. So this is actually the logic of new Turkish foreign policy, which in last 10, 15, 20 years is actually a little bit different. Turkey would also like to have its own sphere of influence. Turkey, according to Davutoglu's Strategic Debt book, Turkey has been working for NATO since 1945 till late 90s. And he said in his book, okay, now is the time that Turkey worked for itself. And this is what they are doing. And you see, they are not following sanctions imposed by the EU, sanctions imposed by most of the NATO member countries. They are behaving on their own and thinking about their national interest. So I think Turkey is positioning itself quite well. It also shows it is quite independent from the US. US no longer can impose anything substantial to Turkey. They have been buying the S-400 system from Russia before this crisis. So Turkey is showing muscles to behave independently, even though it is a member state of the NATO.
Thank you, Dr. Emir. Yeah. So Dr. Emir, yes, one question for you is from Haji Fadlullah Wilmot. Yeah, is a Russian invasion of Ukraine the first step towards expanding its control of Eastern Europe? Is the American order worse than the Russian order for Europe?
You're asking me?
Yes.
So, as I said earlier, I think the Russian strategic goal is not Ukraine. It will not stop in Donbass. The Russia is concerned about the whole periphery, about the whole Near East. They would like to have a control over Estonia, Lithuania, Georgia, Ukraine. They like to control the whole Central and Eastern Europe. This is their goal. They like to have multipolar Europe. So, and they like those countries to become less democratic. They like them to reflect Russia's image, to become authoritarian, to become illiberal, to become less free, and to respect Moscow as their new hegemon. So this Russian world is authoritarian world. It is illiberal world. Yes, it is against this LGBT population because of strong influence of Christianity, but it is against many other elements that are relevant for democracy, for freedom, for choice. I think for Muslims, for Islam, if you take some democratic countries where, if you take some elements of Islam, where you can find Islam, you can find Islam in Sweden, in Finland, in Denmark, in democratic countries, more than you can find Islam in Muslim countries, which are autocrat, authoritarian, illiberal, and Muslims are running away from those countries and going where? To Europe, to find what? Freedom. They want their jobs, they want freedom of expression, they want decent life. They could not find that decent life in their own countries that are under authoritarian regimes. So Russia is offering that kind of world, authoritarian European part. What is America offering? Well, America has been very bad in some other theaters, especially in Iraq. Bloody war. America is guilty 100%. It has been guilty in Afghanistan. It has caused many atrocities. Many people suffered. Millions of people suffered as a result of American intervention in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and elsewhere. But these are all other I could say theaters. In Europe, their behavior is quite different. Europe is already liberal. It is already democratic. So they don't need to impose democracy. They don't need to impose their liberal hegemony. It is well accepted. As I said, it is more attractive. These European states, first of all, Western European states, and nowadays Central and Eastern European states, they prefer America. They prefer American liberal hegemony over Russian authoritarian hegemony. This is the choice. You can have either American liberal hegemony or you can have Russian authoritarian hegemony. This is, of course, simplification of reality. But at the end, this is the choice they face. And when they face this choice, having their historical experience, what happened in Hungary, 1956, what happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968, what happens, I don't know, in other countries, they realize based on their national memory, they better stay with the US. At least they have some freedom. They have some freedom to decide. With Russia, they have much, much less freedom. So I think overall, that is why we Bosnians also have chosen American liberal hegemony. With all its weaknesses, with all its shortcomings, with all problems, we prefer this world order than authoritarian, because we are scared of this authoritarian regime. We know what has happened when there is an anarchy. Genocide happened in Srebrenica in 1995. This could have been repeated in Kosovo. You know, millions of Albanians were on march. They were leaving Kosovo. Had not Americans intervened in 1999, these people would be killed. So these are the choices that we face today. And I think Balkan region, because of its geography, it is not in the immediate Russian near abroad. It is deep inside NATO. It is deep inside EU. And its logical choice is European, Euro-Atlantic liberal order. With this order, we can prosper, we can move forward, and we can live in peace. In another world, I don't think we can live in a peace. That is another problem that we can face potentially.
Thank you, Dr. Emir. Dr. Olsi, I can see the smirk on your face. I don't think you agree with that. So I think you believe that America is a scum for the moral order in the world. So what's your view? I would like to ask you the same question.
Well, no, I in general agree with Dr. Emir. For example, me myself, I would better prefer to live in US corporatocracy rather than in a totalitarian state like China. But Russia is not an authoritarian state in that sense. I've been to Russia. You have nowadays a European citizen is freer in Russia to say whatever he wants than he is in Germany. You can watch, you can write anything you want in the VKontakte, which is the Russian Facebook, but you cannot write anything you want against Israel in the Facebook because you'll immediately be censored, banned, and even have your profile deleted. So when it comes to the issue of freedoms, I think in Russia you have freedom, but only when it comes to power. Of course, power is controlled by those people who control the power. Even in the United States or in Canada, I'm Canadian myself, you cannot do a regime change in Canada. We saw what happened in Ottawa like a month ago. we had trackers who were peacefully protesting, and we saw what did the Trudeau government do to them. They declared them a terrorist. For what? Doing nothing. But if you see what happens in Russia, you have a free press, you have opposition, you have people who insult Putin. I see people from the Academy of Sciences of Moscow who go on CNN and on France 24 and insult Putin, and nobody removes them from their job. But if you do that in Canada, you will end up for the rest of your life as a truck driver or a construction worker. So I do not buy this argument that in Russia you don't have freedom, number one. And number two is that people are, and Muslims are escaping to Europe for freedom. It is 100% wrong. The reason why many Muslims nowadays live in totalitarian dictatorship countries like Saudi Arabia, like United Arab Emirates or Qatar, is not because they love democracy, but because they love money. And we have millions of Europeans or hundreds of thousands, let us say, who work in China and who work in the Middle East. And what about these people? Don't they love democracy? They do. I mean, even us here in Malaysia, do we have democracy for us as foreigners? No, we are here on visa. We cannot be elected. We cannot change the government here, but we're here because of economy, not because we love the democracy of Malaysia. You give us the salary and we stay here. You cut us the salary, we'll go to teach to Qatar or to Bahrain, to a totalitarian dictatorship. And I think the reason why many Muslims nowadays live in, because I hate this argument which the Americans do it, and it is totally fake. The Syrians who are in Germany, the Iraqis who are in France, or many Muslim Albanians and Bosnians who are in United Kingdom, it's not because they want there for British democracy and liberalism, but they want because of money. And we see what happens. Many of these immigrants, if they get a job offer to go and work in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia, or even in Beijing, they are going to run. Anyhow, I agree with Dr. Emir that I think the so-called American liberal order, which is liberal in general, you can insult even Allah and Muhammad, but you cannot insult only Israel and the homosexuals. This order in general is better. Of course, when Americans do not become extremists like they became under the Bush administration after 11 September, when they declared all us Muslims as a terrorist, and we were under mass surveillance, where people were afraid to go and pray in mosques in the West because they were being followed up by secret services. But in general, when we compare between a world dominated, let us say, by China or the United States, I believe that the majority of mankind, of course, will go on the side of the United States. But I do believe that if we have a world that will be dominated by Russia, which is impossible because Russia doesn't have the manpower or the resources to do that, it will not be that very bad. But in my opinion, I think, as I mentioned here and in other places, the Russian intervention in Ukraine is a good news for the mankind and international community, because after all, this intervention will make the Americans to be more polite with Muslims. So as Dr. Emir mentioned, we're having many European officials who nowadays go to Ankara and in Istanbul, and we have Zelensky who begs Erdogan, because finally the Westerners and the Americans understood that we Muslims are also important. And moreover, we have the case of Iran, which the Americans, they destroyed it. Since the time of Trump administration, people in Iran didn't have even possibility to buy medicines because they were under a totalitarian embargo, and this was made because of Israel and because Iran didn't accept to sell Palestine to Israelis, and that is why the Americans suffocated the Iranians. And now, thanks to Russia and the war in Ukraine, we're having the Americans who are going back to the Iranians and are telling to them, okay, forgive us for everything. They're removing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard from the terrorist list. They're removing all the embargoes, and they're telling to the Iranians, you are no longer terrorists, but we're friends. Please sell us oil and gas because we cannot survive without you. So I think that the rise of Russia and its intervention in Ukraine is good for the Muslim Ummah. And when we see the two core countries of Islam, which are Turkey and Iran, we see how their situation is improving. I hope and pray that Turkey doesn't join the war of NATO against Russia, but plays the smart Ottoman game that it knows to play very well, to let the West and the East fight each other, and then that we can benefit. This is how the Ottoman Empire expanded after all. They used the divisions of the Christians in Europe, and this is how Islam expanded in Europe.
Thank you, Dr. Olsi. I'll take this as your concluding remarks. How about Dr. Emir? Would you like to have any concluding remarks for this webinar?
Yeah, I can say maybe this. I fully agree with Dr. Olsi that consequences of this war between Ukraine and Russia for Turkey and Iran, that is another great example, are quite good. And I also agree with Dr. Olsi that maybe Muslim countries should stay out of this fight. This is not our fight. This is not our war, even though Muslims in Balkan region could be affected. And we are clearly on the side of the NATO in this fight, but we are not a member and we are not going to participate in this war at all. But generally speaking, this will give a chance, this will provide opportunities for Muslim countries, especially Turkey, Iran, maybe some others as well, to have more space to breathe. For Iran especially, who was isolated for so many years without reasons, and now Iran is really he's again an interview. So Iran will have a great comeback to this agreement, 5+1 agreement with regards to its nuclear program. The sanctions might be removed, and the Iranian people will be able to live normal life. This is what I hope for. So, but again, this is a structural war, and I'm a little bit scared that this is not going to end quite soon. Even though if we have a ceasefire, if we have an agreement, this will be unresolved because this is structural. Structural wars are most dangerous wars. So all parties, all players should be very careful. Especially you see that the Russia, I don't know, is it for the first time? I have not followed. They said now we are increasing our nuclear alert. So somebody can push the button and then we are all finished. So this is the danger that we are living in, today. Hopefully the reason will prevail, the rationality will prevail, and things will get better. But we can only pray for this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emir, for these concluding remarks. So, well, the session has come to an end. I hope you have enjoyed this session organized by the Islamic Renaissance Front Malaysia. Yeah, this is our last session, yeah, before Ramadan starts. So I would like to thank all our organizers, yeah, at the Islamic Renaissance Front and also the Islam and Liberty Network for putting all this together. Yeah, and I would like to wish our audience happy Ramadan, and we look forward to seeing you again for our next webinar. With that, I would like to say to all of you, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.